Welcome to tonight's Extreme Lives, coming to you from Manila in the Philippines. We have a special location tonight. We're in the Rappler Studios. Joining me tonight is Maria Ressa. Thank you, Maria, for joining us. Maria is the executive editor and the CEO of Rappler, the online news website. Thank you, Maria. Maria, you have been very vocal recently about the power of social media to fuel extremism, drive radicalization. You've also recently been looking at the situation in Marawi, sort of 1 year after the siege, where all of these threads have come together. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
So I think there are two very interesting things that are happening right now, right? The first, here in the Philippines, it's a little more than a year after the siege of Marawi. And think about this, right? This is the very first time that ISIS-linked groups have taken over land outside of Iraq and Syria, right? And then they didn't just take it over, they held it for 5 months. So it was lauded as a victory and was used to recruit from other parts of the world. Some of the things the propaganda that we saw on ISIS's own accounts, their social media streams were saying, you have to come to the Philippines for jihad. It's not a new call. I mean, as early as 2011 on YouTube, a Filipino jihadist speaking Arabic asked global jihadists to come to the Philippines for jihad. We have in Mindanao, in the southern Philippines, training camps, essentially what became training camps for these. But what's interesting in that group is that you had local groups that connected through social media. So you had photos, videos, content that was created in Marawi that was then uploaded onto ISIS Central's own accounts. And for a period of time, they were able to commandeer the narrative in the Philippines.
So in terms of the recruitment, where were they putting the content out to? You're saying they're going onto the global websites. Were they drawing people from particular countries to Marawi? Where were the foreign fighters coming from predominantly? Were they from Asia or were they from worldwide?
It was worldwide, but primarily, again, like if you look at this as waves of radicalization, right, in terms of ideology, before there was Al-Qaeda, there were our own homegrown groups, and then they were hijacked by Al-Qaeda. And then after Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Islamic State, the ideology became far more radical, and then they took over many of these same networks in our country. So the call, they saw a lot of Indonesians, the Southeast Asian jihadists, plus also jihadists from other parts of the world. It was a successful call to come and fight in the Philippines. And part of the reason that it took authorities 5 months to be able to regain control. What happened is that all of this content allowed Filipinos access. I mean, there is a group inside ISIS that is Southeast Asians, and as early as July 2016, you had 3 Southeast Asians, a Malaysian, an Indonesian, and a Filipino. They beheaded folks wearing orange jumpsuits. They were part of ISIS. It was pushed out on ISIS channels, and they asked for these jihadists to come to the Philippines. So we saw the run-up to it. The intelligence didn't fail, because we were doing stories that showed you that the jihadists were coming to the Philippines, but how they were able to, I think it was maybe a failure to appreciate the intelligence that was there. So from social media, they connected, and you saw this, it was a very scary pipeline. Mm-hmm. But then as ISIS was pushed out, as forces, Western forces, I suppose, as they gained victory, then we saw this pipeline shut down.
So what's happened now with these people? Have they left? And I mean, you've been studying jihadist groups in this part of the world for a long time. Have they been part of like long-term networks, these groups, or is this something new? Are there sort of some veterans there, or are they very young, or are they all a variation of groups?
So it's a little of all of that. So the first is that the networks remain the same. They're families, right? Yeah. So for example, the family that actually went in and planned this is a family that was affiliated with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Once, the largest Muslim separatist group, but they signed a peace agreement. But we also had generations, right? So the group that actually helped train Jemaah Islamiyah, the group that was hijacked by Al Qaeda. That generation has handed to the younger ones, and these younger ones are the ones that were involved in the siege. I think there's also a difference in terms of ideology. In the Philippines, unlike say Indonesia, which has the world's largest Muslim population, in the Philippines, our problem is governance and poverty. It isn't as ideologically driven as it is in Indonesia, where that ideology is incredibly important and attractive. In the Philippines, it is bad governance, corruption, the collusion with armed groups, the local government's own use of these armed groups. Right? If you are a young kid in some of these parts of Mindanao, you need to ally. You need to get a gun, and you need to ally with a group. Otherwise, law and order is so weak that is part of their own structures.
So you were telling me a little earlier that you knew, as journalists, Rappler knew that there was recruitment going on in the ground in Marawi.
As early as 2015.
And how was that recruitment happening? And what were they using to entice people? Who were they targeting?
So we're finishing a study that will be launched next week with the Asia Foundation on countering violent extremism, right? And exactly what's left after this pipeline with ISIS. And what we saw, so let me go with what we saw experientially. In 2015, students who we were working with in Marawi came to us and told us they were being recruited. I mean, these anecdotal evidence, it is very clear. Students didn't really know what to do with it, but they were in their communities. And the actual recruitment of the foot soldiers in the Marawi siege were young kids that were recruited by the mother, Farhana, of the Maute brothers, right? So
the Maute brothers.
Sorry, the Maute brothers is the group that actually began to plan this siege.
And they themselves had international links, didn't they?
Although they did have international links. Their father, I mean, again, radicalized. Their father was an engineer who was part of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Money coming in from outside. We know this now from intelligence that significant funds came in from outside. What's interesting, and this is the good news, is that the kinds of activity we've seen on social media earlier this year, is really opportunistic. Meaning, unlike before, when it was far more methodical and there was a direct link, Telegram, for example, was used. Marawi, an account in Marawi was pushing out a Telegram group that had more than 10,000 people, and then from there, ISIS would then pick it up and push it out through its formal channels. That's gone. And what you're seeing is individual recruitment, right? And there's kind of a funnel that we showed you on this report. It's first, the first layer of the funnel is the open social media platforms. That's Facebook, YouTube. You can see some of that radicalization. Abu Sayyaf group, for example, used YouTube to try to get more ransom for an Australian who was kidnapped, right? So this the top layer, then the funnel shrinks a little bit more. Here is kind of like one-on-one. They can go through mediated. It's not as public, and that would be like on Facebook Messenger. In some countries, in Indonesia, it would go to WhatsApp. In the Philippines, not so much. And then finally, the very last one is, once you're on Telegram, you have to download Telegram. And this Telegram can be one-to-many, like 10,000 people in a super Telegram group, but it's also one-to-one. So, and then after that, the final point is physical contact. So that's the funnel for radicalization in the Philippines.
And so that recruitment funnel, at the very end of it, where it becomes again person to person or small group contact, who was running that in Marawi? Are you saying that it was Farhana Maute? Was she one of the chief recruiters?
Yes. And again, part of the reason these young boys joined was precisely because they had no jobs. And they weren't being educated, right? They wanted formal education. She actually lured them by saying, you will get educated, and they were part of the reason. They were the foot soldiers. I think you looking at the parts of the southern Philippines, it's food, water, jobs, education. right? These are the things that drive recruitment. People want better lives.
So the solution is governance and
better governance.
better governance and more development.
More development, right? I mean, we've been saying this since my first book, Seeds of Terror. I wrote it in 2002. I mean, published in 2003, shortly after 9/11, and that's the very same problem.
But what about for those people who are coming to join the struggle from other Southeast Asian countries or from abroad? They're not coming for the same reasons. So what has happened to those people, and are they still organizing? Are they still recruiting, or are these a fluid group of people who move around the region and find opportunities where
So,
they can?
again, a little bit of both, right? I mean, they're the ones who've been in the Philippines. Like, for example, there's a Singaporean who's been in the Philippines since shortly after 9/11, right? His name is Mawia. There is the suicide bombers that we've had in the Philippines. They're actually not Filipinos. The very first one that came was an Egyptian member of Al Qaeda, and he carried out a suicide bombing to try to inspire Filipinos. But I always say Filipinos are smarter. Sorry, it's a joke, but it's so Filipinos haven't followed. And then just this year there was another suicide bomb, and again, it's very difficult. I mean, I push for greater transparency from authorities because this kind of for a long time the Philippine government and the Philippine military under President Aquino denied the existence of these ISIS linked groups, which makes the public more vulnerable to recruitment. The way you protect your public is educate them, right? That someone is trying to recruit you for these radical plots. By shielding that, by trying to pretend they didn't exist, I think we were more vulnerable. One of the best things President Duterte did early on, by August, so he took office in the end of June, the beginning of July. By August, he said, ISIS is here. The last interview I did with him in December 2016, he said one of his cousins is in ISIS. So I think that's the first step. Now, of course, having said that, this administration didn't really prevent the takeover of Marawi, right? And they were caught flat-footed.
What is happening now in terms of the siege ended? Obviously, there was a lot of destruction in that area. What happened to those? Obviously, many people were killed as well. What happened to the hardcore? Many of them were killed, but the foreign fighters, perhaps some of the young recruits who had been really truly radicalized, who weren't going to kind of melt back into society. Where are they? What's happening with them?
They're here, right? And the threat is worse today, precisely because while you've gouged out the top and middle rank leadership, you have the viruses in play and continues to spread. And frankly, we have never done well with countering violent extremism, right? I think we're at a point earlier this year when the government and the military started talking about PVE, preventing violent extremism. But the first step is truly one, to deal with the people who are homeless. There's very little has really been done yet. We've been waiting for concrete action to get these people back into homes. I mean, all of Marawi has been destroyed, and again, part of that is because of the type of warfare, right? It's guerrilla warfare, and then it was a strafing, a bombing run. And part of that is because our military didn't have the capability to go to do guerrilla warfare in urban zones.
And what about the fact that although Marawi, the infrastructure has been destroyed, many people killed, but in terms of messaging on social media, it became even more potent, didn't it? I mean, the messaging that was put out by global jihadist groups increased
for a period of time. Yeah, absolutely. Like, and those 5 months, for example, that the groups held Marawi, the propaganda coming out of ISIS Central and Indonesia. Indonesia was, and the Malaysian groups. This had actually increased and was showing victory, right? Trying to entice other jihadists to come here, and they were successful. The question now is, what do you do with the people whose family were killed? Right? What happens to those who are already extremists to begin with? How are they being addressed by government? How were they being given livelihood? How is counter radicalization actually happening? And when you ask when you ask these questions, the answers you get are quite vague. We've had martial law for more than a year, and there's plans to extend martial law. But as we've always known, this is not just a military problem. This is a problem that it's a social problem. It's an education problem. In the Philippines, it's alleviating poverty and bringing in good governance, right?
But it also isn't just a battle that's being fought on the ground. It's a social media
Absolutely.
battle, which is something that I want to talk to you about because
Sure.
I know you have very strong views about this. So we have a situation on the ground. Recruitment has been done via this funnel system, which involves social media as well, but still at the very end, it's still face-to-face recruitment. What else is going on here in terms of the ability of these groups to be able to use these platforms to put their message out somewhat with impunity? What's been happening here?
I mean, so take a look at the trends that have happened, right? This year, you had families killing themselves in Indonesia, in Surabaya, in a country that didn't have these types of. This is a new thing. The radicalization happens not just in the physical world, but when you add social media, you increase it exponentially. You know, I always say social networks are our family and friends. Social media are your family and friends on steroids. And Katiba Nusantara, which is the battalion that was created by Southeast Asians in ISIS, recruited families. You know, and it's this virus doesn't go away. It morphs, it evolves, but you slowly push it further away. So social media, in many ways, brought in more people. I mean, it's very similar. I mean, online radicalization always leads to real world violence.
When you wrote the book, From Bin Laden to Facebook, is that the correct
The
title?
second book, yeah.
The second book that you wrote. I mean, so you've been involved in looking at this connection for quite some time.
Yes.
How do you see it evolving? What has changed since when you started researching that book to now in terms of the way that social media is being used, or perhaps the way that the social media companies are also responding to the fact that their platforms are being used?
Yeah, I think, when you talk about terrorism and the ideology of terrorism, in many ways, normal people step away, right? The majority, they think that this can be controlled. So some of the tactics that, say, Twitter or Facebook used were supposedly effective. But then when you put it into our real world context, and I'll talk about the world post 2015, when news was brought into Facebook, and the Philippines is 97% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. Facebook is our internet, like Indonesia and Myanmar, right? The global south, any country where Facebook is zero rated, meaning you will get it free on your phone.
You don't have to use your data to pay for it.
Correct.
So it moderates the internet for you in a way.
That is your internet, right? I mean, and in the Philippines, for example, you cannot, the minute you click through to an article, you have to pay. So it's very easy to manipulate people because they don't click through to read more. You can just take a headline and mislead them. What happened in 2015 is Facebook took in all the news groups, asked them to come on board the platform. They were running after Twitter, which is where news was. And it wasn't an algorithm based, it was pretty linear on Twitter.
So instant stories.
Instant articles.
Instant articles.
Right? So once instant articles happened, the algorithms of Facebook didn't change. But news went on, and facts were treated the same way as the joke your mom said and what you had for dinner. And when you had that, it left the world open to the weaponization of social media. And we saw that. The first time we really saw it used on YouTube was in the Ukraine. Russian disinformation. Then all of a sudden it went global in a very short period of time, after 2015. 2016, in May, President Duterte was elected. A month later, it was Brexit. And then a few months later, the election of Donald Trump. And what we've seen by November of 2017, Freedom House came out with a report that said cheap armies on social media are rolling back democracy in 30 of the 65 countries it had studied. There's huge impact of this disinformation. It makes the way it's been set up, and we did a study where we talked about patriotic trolling. This is online state-sponsored hate to silence dissent. You control the narrative. In the United States, the Mueller report looks at the Russian participation, but essentially the tactic is you pound a fracture line of society. In the United States, it could be racial relations, right? It could be immigration in Europe, but whatever it is, you pound it until it splinters, and then you fuel hate on both sides. In the Philippines, it's the gap between the rich and the poor, the gap between the capital and our provinces. So you fuel anger and hate.
So the social media platform is, in their view, democratizing information, but in a way they're treating all information as being valid, equally valid. Is that your concern? Everything is considered to be equally valid according to the algorithms, unless they're manipulated to not be so.
So not only is everything equally valid, lies spread faster than truth, right? So facts become something you can argue about. This is a can of Coke. I mean, Coke Zero, just to be, it's a can. But someone can say, no, that's really an apple.
Mm-hmm.
And the apple can win, depending on how it's presented. Anger spreads fastest. I think what we're seeing is all of a sudden social media preys on the worst of human nature, encourages the worst of human nature. And then the behavior of some of the leaders we've elected around the world also encourages, gives people permission to bring out this kind of rage.
So if the internet and Facebook are almost synonymous in in Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, what can be done to stop that? I mean, while people still have access to information, is the problem not only lying with the social media companies that obviously want to get that reach, but what about the regulation and the telecommunications companies that also work with them?
I think so I always say we're at an existential moment right now. It's existential for news groups, for journalists, because we're under attack. Exponential lies. At the same time, the business of journalism is under attack by the very same platforms where these things are happening. It's an existential moment for an old way of thinking about power. New power is technology, right? That's really what's changed. Old power, is governance that moves at a much slower pace. You would expect old power to try to regulate this, but the problem is they don't understand the new power. And new power doesn't understand the power structures they're disrupting.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of those instances where I think, it's like after World War II, countries around the world came together and realized, after Hiroshima, right? Everyone realized that this nuclear bomb, this atom bomb, can kill all of us, and we have to come together to try to find a solution. Otherwise, we will self-destruct. As an
the problem is it's global. So you have regulation in one country, the tech companies will move to another country.
Right. So I think for me, it's not just that. I think countries are already trying regulation. Right? But I'm saying we go back to, I think this is one of those times where we have to say, what are the principles of the internet that will lead to preserving our humanity? How can we do that? And that's one of the initiatives. I sit on the Information and Democracy Commission that's out of Paris that has pulled together 25 people from 18 different countries to try to talk about these principles. And then there are other initiatives. Germany, of course, has already regulated Facebook. Europe.
But what about in Asia? Has there been any move?
Well, not only that, of course, some of the governments are using it very well for their purposes, right? And you can control the narrative this way. It weakens democracies. So where do we go from here? I think part of that is, let's agree on what the principles are. And then the second part is, the only group that can actually solve this in the short term are the social media platforms themselves, the technology platforms. And when I talk to them, we're partners of Facebook, and I always say, this is enlightened self-interest. You have to fix the problems that you've created. You have to strengthen democracies. You cannot let hate groups stifle narratives. You can't be gamed in this way.
Are they listening? But when you have comments by Zuckerberg, Facebook CEO, saying we're not we're not in the business of media and publishing, we're just a technology company. What's your response to that?
I think they're slowly realizing that's not the case and that they can't push aside the responsibility. Look, the reality is that news groups are no longer the gatekeepers. Right? In the old world order, we had the ability to determine facts from fiction, and we were held liable when we made mistakes. And that protected the public sphere. Now that the gatekeeping powers, the world's largest distributor of news is Facebook. The world's largest distributor of news videos is YouTube, right? So, you look at these, and if they do not distinguish between fact and fiction, how can we have this discourse that is necessary for a democracy to grow?
They would say that they're doing their best, that they're partnering with organizations like Rappler to look at verifying news. And could you tell us a little bit about how that works as well, this verification project that you're working on? I mean, is it a drop in the ocean? Is it enough? You tell me what your experience has
So all
been.
the studies have already shown that fact checking doesn't work, right? And that it is, if you're just doing fact checking alone, it's whack-a-mole. You'll just, for me, it's not looking at content. You don't look at content. You look at the networks that spread it. The same way you look at terrorism, right? When you're trying to catch a terrorist, you look at the networks that they're part of. And let's just say the son of the Maute group. That guy could be under observation, so he goes on a watch list. That's the same, that's similar to what would work in terms of looking at networks that spread this information. But I think here's what the social media platforms face if they don't do it. And it's already happened in the Philippines, right? From the time Rappler began, 2012 until 2016, Facebook was number one on Alexa ranking. But mid-2016, by July 2016, when the drug war began, and the exponential hate came and flooded Facebook with toxic sludge, this exponential hate, by October 2016, we were under such intense attack, the people around the room, that we had to figure out what were we going to do. It's not just us. By January 2017, Facebook dropped from number 1 to number 8 on Alexa ranking. And it hasn't fully recovered. It's not back at number 1. People turned it off because it was too toxic. Facebook doesn't want that to happen. They're now, if you look today on Alexa ranking, Facebook is number 5. But it was number 1 from the time we began until 2016. So it is in its own interest to actually clean it up. And then beyond that, what kind of governance will they help elect, right? This is part of what Facebook is really working at now, is election integrity.
And we have so many important elections coming up in the next year or so.
Absolutely.
We have Philippines.
Philippines in May, Indonesia.
Possibly
India.
Thailand.
Yes. We'll see what you should tell me about Thailand, right? But I think in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, for example, take a look at the strong action Facebook took there. Not only did it take down the networks, well, of course, 600 to 700,000 people have been forced out of their homes, more than 10,000 people killed, and that violence was fomented by the military. And what Facebook did was to basically not allow them to go on the platform, right? And you saw a quick repercussion to that action, because a week later, the two journalists from Reuters were sentenced. So we keep looking at what's happening there. But again, I always say, in the global south, every day Facebook doesn't take action means someone dies.
So final thoughts, any kind of words of wisdom, what can be done to promote truth and integrity of information, robust journalism in this region?
I think critical is for the people who now have the power to actually determine what fact is, to be responsible for it. If they don't become responsible for it, if they don't take action before government does, then regulations will follow. I think what you've also seen, and let's talk about the United States, there was one weekend where you had 4 acts of domestic terrorism fueled by social media. Hatred on social media, that was the synagogue in Pittsburgh. That was also the same week that Cesar Sayok, the pipe bombs, right? The bombs that were mailed to different people. And then there was Kentucky, and then shortly after, Tallahassee. all of these things happen because of radicalization on social media. There is a direct link. We've always known it with terrorism. When you pump prime violence online, it erupts in real world violence. And I think that's something that, tech guys, you change the world. You have to realize the impact you're having and what the kind of, you can't break democracy globally. It has a direct impact on them as well. So I appeal to their better natures.
Maria Ressa, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, coming from Manila in the Philippines, the Rappler office around us, where everybody's been wonderfully quiet while we've been having our discussion. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time at Extreme Lives. Thank you.